We're going to dive into a short sermon. I promise it won't be very long this morning. And if those of you, if you're in the coffee hall and you would like to join us, no, there's nobody in there, so we're good? Okay, we're good. So we did fit everybody. So you guys, if you want to, can move back to the center if you want. No, they're like far away from you as possible. I get it. So Christmas is a time we get to give and exchange Christmas presents. It's primarily about relationships, spending time with our loved ones, which relationships, our loved ones, friends, and family are definitely the most important things in our lives. Are they not? Yes. Today, I hope that by gathering here this evening, we can pause, we can laugh, we can drink coffee, and we can take a moment to kind of remind ourselves what's important, and that we're better able to be present tonight, tomorrow, the next few days with our friends, family, and our kids as well. So today I want to start off, again, I said I'm not going to talk long, so I promise I won't talk too long, but as we begin a little bit of history to start off with. There are 4 Gospels in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Interesting to note that the first gospel ever written, Mark, probably about 40 years after the death of Jesus, has no mention of the birth story. So we get what we know as the Christmas story from 2 other gospels that were written afterwards, Matthew and Luke. John doesn't really talk about it much, so it's Matthew and Luke. And what's interesting is they shed very different perspectives on the Christmas story. So how many of you have ever been to a Christmas pageant before, seen that with the stable, the manger? Okay, that's like a concoction of both of those gospels into 2. And they shed different perspectives, I think, for a very specific reason. For example, in Luke, we have the famous text that most of us would be able to, if not recite, know fairly familiar. And Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger because there was no place for him at the inn. Matthew makes no mention of swaddling clothes, manger, or inn, which is interesting. Different perspectives, right? In Luke's gospel, we have a story of angels coming and greeting shepherds, which, by the way, when something like that happens, it's always interesting to me. Like, why them? Why the shepherds, right? Matthew's gospel makes no mention of shepherds. In fact, they talk about 3 wise men. So today, for a moment, I'd like to invite you to hone in on the gospel story of Matthew and asking the question, what can this birth story of Jesus tell us about God and our world today? We're going to examine 2 parts to this. First is Emmanuel. Who knows what Emmanuel means? God with us. Good. A little bit of response there. Thank you. Emmanuel, God with us. So we're going to talk about Emmanuel, and then we're going to talk about the 3 kings. So first, I want to invite you to read along with me Matthew chapter 1, and it was up on the screen. And when I say read along with me, I did that one time, and everybody started to read, and it was like this awkward, should I say? So you guys don't have to read. I'll read it. You can follow along with me. Matthew 1, verse 22 and 23. All this took place to fulfill what has been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So what's going on here? If you begin to dive into this story a little bit, don't have to be a scholar, just a little bit dive in, you'll notice quickly that what Matthew is doing, he's quoting a prophet from Isaiah. But why? Matthew's gospel, most scholars agree Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience, probably himself a Jew, writing to a Jewish audience, using their sacred scriptures. He recounts back to the prophet Isaiah, really Isaiah chapter 7. So putting this in a little bit of context, this would have been the year 735 BCE. There's a king of Judah named King Ahaz. And there was 2 other kingdoms that were getting ready to attack their kingdom. And these 2 kings were getting ready to attack them, and all the people were scared and worried, what's going to happen? And the prophet Isaiah says, don't worry. These kings will not attack. You are safe. You're fine. And then he goes on to say there's going to be a sign. And we can read on the next slide. Follow along with me as I read. The Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey. By the time he knows how to refuse the evil, choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil, choose the good, the land before those two kings you are in dread will be deserted. First of all, notice the word young woman here in this translation. In the Greek, in the Old Testament Greek called the Septuagint, that word is parthenos, which can mean virgin or young woman. In the Hebrew, alma, same thing, virgin or young woman. Clearly, they translate this one, young woman, because they believe, of course, it's a woman who has had relations, to use the biblical language here, with a man, and now will conceive a son. So that's interesting to know. We don't know who the young woman was. It could have been the king's wife. It could have been the prophet's wife. We don't know. But this is a prophecy given by Isaiah to a people in the year 735 BCE. So why is Matthew using that to introduce the birth story of Jesus? It's interesting. So when you begin to uncover some of these things, you're like, wait a second. That was a prophecy way back in the day that had nothing to do with Jesus. It wasn't prophesying about Jesus, yet Matthew picks it out and says, here it is. So it's easy when you begin to dive into some of these things, and many of us have gone through this, to go through a sort of deconstruction, disillusionment. It's a big conspiracy. Something's going on. Look at what I found. Matthew, what are you doing? I think Matthew knew exactly what he was doing. If he was writing to a Jewish audience, they would have known about this prophecy. They would have known about the book of Isaiah. They would have known that it was a prophecy that happened 730 some years ago. By the way, Jesus probably wasn't born on 0. He probably was born 4 BCE, so our calendars are a little bit off, so roughly 730 years ago. It wasn't like Matthew was trying to create a conspiracy and get something underneath. He was making a correlation. Hey, you know the story 730 years ago? There was this prophecy, and somehow God was with us in that. Well, now there's something new happening. And in a similar way, I think God is with us. And I'm starting this story for a very specific reason. Emmanuel, God with us. What is Matthew saying here? First, I think Matthew is saying, this is part of your tradition, your scriptures, right? I'm connecting that and saying, that's part of your story, but God is doing something new. And not new in the sense of completely different or separate, but new in the sense of your story is past tense, but now God is continuing this story present tense. The story is unfolding, connecting the old to the new. As God was with us back then, now God is with us now. The story is unfolding. Are you with me? The second thing I think Matthew is probably doing is making a theological statement. God with us. God is not separate from us, detached from us, somewhere out there. There was a book that I read called The Death of a Mythic God. Interesting title, isn't it? It was written by a monk turned lawyer, Washington, D.C. lawyer. And I like to read one quote, and you can follow along on the screen here. He writes, "For the past 3,000 years, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and most believers of other faiths, has held what the psychologists and theorists of evolution of human consciousness now call a mythic conception of God." That's a mouthful, isn't it? In other words, God has been seen as a being who lives in the sky or heaven, being separate from humans, all creation, as a being who responds to prayer and sometimes to punish, supernaturally intervenes, whether often or from time to time, in the human condition. In other words, for many people, when they think of God, they get a picture like this next slide up here. This is God. By the way, this was taken off of Google. You can Google image this. This is Zeus. It's interesting to see the correlations and the influence of Greek mythology in the Judeo-Christian tradition to some extent. But I think this is a picture many people have when they think of God. Is this an accurate picture, though? Perhaps Matthew is saying, yes, but God is here, not there, not getting ready to cast lightning bolts down. One author, a spiritual leader, Rob Bell, wrote a book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God, and he says this in his book: I've encountered this conception of God countless times over the years, a perspective that isn't as much about who God is as where God is. I've heard people pray and ask God to be with them. I've heard songs inviting God to come near, all of these undergirded by the subtle yet powerful belief that God is somewhere else, and he comes down here from this world from time to time to do God's sorts of things. I've been there. I've prayed those prayers. I've sang those songs. But I wonder, what does that mean when we do that? What is that statement saying when we ask God, God, come here? Is Matthew saying, no, God is already here. God is with us. Think about the ramifications for just that statement alone, a God who is with us. If that's true, if God is here, if God is with us, if God surrounds all things, is in all places, perhaps then our greatest aim in life is to simply become more aware of the God who is here. So on Christmas, when we open presents, when we spend time with friends and family, when we drink good wine, maybe a little bit too much, but that's okay. Maybe in those moments, becoming aware that this time, these moments are sacred, that God is somehow here and present with us. So let's talk about three kings. Matthew chapter 2. Follow along with me on the slide. It says, in the time King Herod, by the way, because we think that King Herod died around 4 BC, so that's part of the reason we think Jesus was born, probably before BCE. In the time King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, where is the child who has been born of the Jews? For we observed his star as it's rising and have come to pay him homage. So when we talk about three kings, first, if you're catching on, it doesn't say three kings. So they weren't kings. It says magi. I find this story, this part of the story, particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. One I'm going to get into, but one reason, and I didn't even think about this until I was putting this kind of message together, but anybody grow up in the church? Anybody ever play in a Christmas pageant before? The very first one I can remember ever being in, I was one of the three wise men. And this was, you know, when you have a memory that you're like, I didn't even remember that until I read this. I'm like, oh yeah. I still remember the church. It was a church my parents actually got married in. I wasn't obviously there for that part. But I still remember the outline and the pews. It was a Baptist church. And I remember putting on this purple robe and this golden crown. And I had this really cool staff. And I got to walk down to that song, We Three Kings of Orient are. And I just felt like, yeah. I'm like, I am a king. And they're told, you got to walk like a king, you know. So I get to dress up and be all cool and suave. And I still remember that. So maybe that's part of my infatuation with the wise men. But I think there's more. And I'd like to explore that with you today. First of all, magi is plural. We don't know how many magi there were. About the Middle Ages, a tradition evolved where there was 3. They brought 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Good. You guys are on top of it. And I think there's a correlation there. I think, oh, they brought 3 gifts. Perhaps there was 3 magi. So there might have been. We just don't know. There was more than one. And secondly, magi was sort of an umbrella term that encompassed a wide range of people, specifically who held religious or special occult powers, including astrologers, fortune tellers, dream interpreters, sorcerers, and magicians. It was most likely, judging by the story, that these wise men were at least astrologers, probably from somewhere like Persia. So, again, what is Matthew doing? So, again, I think Matthew is connecting this story to the Jewish tradition. In the book of Numbers, chapters 24 and 25, we read about a story of Balaam. And eventually, and you can read along with this in verse 17 in the second part, it was a prophecy Balaam gave years ago that said, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. So it was this prophecy, and he's drawing from that prophecy. So let's take a moment, just briefly, to talk about stars and how people viewed stars in the first century. It was then a commonly held assumption from a lot of people that when a star was sighted for the first time, that it meant the birth of a king or ruler or someone of great importance. Likewise, when you saw a shooting star, that was the sign of a death of a ruler, king, or someone of great import. So it wouldn't have been that odd for a group of astrologers being astrologers as they were seeking a sign and finding a star and then heading to Jerusalem. So Matthew, of course, is reflecting on this story of Numbers, but perhaps Matthew is doing something even more subversive here. So let's think about this for a moment. You have a Jew speaking to a Jewish audience, telling this story about these. When you weren't a Jew, you were called a Gentile. Speaking about, and often a pagan, speaking about this group of pagan Gentile astrologers, bringing them into the story and saying somehow they were in tune with something. They were aware of something that was going on and sought out Jerusalem. So they come to Jerusalem and they seek this king of the Jews. And what does the people living in Jerusalem do? Well, let's seek out the council of the religious leaders. Surely they know something's going on. And so the religious leaders seek and says, oh yeah, supposedly there's this person that's supposed to be born in Bethlehem. And the wise men are like, awesome, we're going to head there. And what do the religious leaders do? Nothing. Like, peace out, have fun. And these pagan Gentile astrologers travel to pay homage to this child that was born. Could it be that Matthew is not only connecting a story, but doing something else and saying, it doesn't matter how, where, when, or to whom, God will speak to whoever is paying attention, through ever who is paying attention. We have an online Facebook community, which if you're a part of our One Church community, and you're not a part of the online Facebook community, we invite you, just Google it, and we'll invite you in and be a part of that. But somebody posted just a little blurb of a blog that kind of reflects what I'm getting at here. And the blog post read this: it takes a lot of bravery to search for what God is really saying to us, rather than searching for what we assume God is saying. To look for truth rather than assume we already know what truth is. In the Christmas story, we see a bunch of religious leaders who assumed they knew what truth already was, and we see a bunch of pagan Gentile astrologers open and seeking, and somehow in tune with what God was doing in their midst. Isn't that interesting? I find that story so incredibly fascinating. So perhaps the Christmas story invites us today to ask the question, am I open to God doing something new? Am I open to the ways that God might be showing, speaking, leading in my life? Do I remain open to that? The Christmas story reminds us that God even speaks to and through pagan Gentile astrologers from Persia, people not a part of the story. And if God is doing something new, the Christmas story also reminds us that it's through the everyday, ordinary ways. An ordinary town, an ordinary night, through an ordinary couple. Nothing super special about anything that night. Ordinary ways. And in fact, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I go on those from time to time, but If you think about the way God works, and we use Scripture to kind of help us understand the way God works, when God works in our lives and draws us into something, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. In fact, time and time again, we read the stories of people all throughout the Bible, and when they answered yes and followed God, it was a difficult path. You're talking about a couple that wasn't yet married and became pregnant. That's not easy, especially back then, and they followed that path. So if we are remaining open and saying, God, I'm here, speak to me, lead me, guide me, that doesn't mean it will be an easy path. In fact, it will probably mean there'll be some setbacks. It will be a difficult path. So don't judge whether you're following God or not on how easy or difficult it is. Hear God, listen, be open to others coming around and supporting you through that. The Christmas story is about God doing something very unexpected, yet in very ordinary ways. So I want to invite the worship team to come back on up here. And there's two things that we take away. First, the idea that God is with us. Emmanuel. And I want to take a moment to realize and recognize that sometimes it doesn't feel like God is with us. And that's an okay feeling. And hopefully you have a community that can stand along with you in the midst of that. And the Christmas story reminds us that even if we don't feel it, that somehow God is working. To be open to the ways that God is working in the everyday, ordinary. So my hope and prayer for each of us here tonight is that during Christmas, the days following, that when we interact with our friends and family, and those people even that we struggle to interact with, that say some off-the-cuff political or religious remark that just doesn't settle right, that maybe we can be open enough to first know God's in our midst and God is working in some way, somehow, in the midst of that. Amen?